I was there, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I was 16. I watched your mother. I watched my father. She couldn't finish. I've come to beg your forgiveness. For all of it. Mercy studied her for a long moment. This woman, who had lived in comfort built on her family's suffering. Then she said, I cannot forgive you. That's not mine to give. But I can tell you what my mother would say. Use your guilt. Use it to fight against what your family built. Use it to ensure no other mother loses her child to another man's greed. Constance nodded and left. She would spend the rest of her life funding schools for freed slaves, though she never spoke publicly about why. Montgomery, Alabama, Christmas. Morning 1955, 100 years after Ruth Hartley's desperate act, a seamstress named Rosa Parks stood at the site where Mount Calvary Baptist Church once stood. The land had never been rebuilt upon, left as an empty lot that locals still crossed, themselves when passing. Rosa knew the story. Every black person in Montgomery did. Ruth Hartley, who struck the first blow. Ruth Hartley, who chose death over submission. Ruth Hartley, whose ghost was said to walk whenever injustice grew too heavy to bear. In a few days, Rosa would refuse to give up her seat on a bus. When asked later what gave her the courage, she would mention many things: her faith, her exhaustion with injustice, the support of her community. But privately, she would think of Ruth Hartley standing in a church aisle with a kitchen knife, declaring that fear had no more power over her. Present day, Montgomery, Alabama, the empty lot where Mount Calvary Baptist Church once stood is now a small park. There's no historical marker. The city council voted against it 3 times. But every Christmas morning people leave flowers. Red roses for the blood spilled, white lilies for the innocents lost, and always, always, someone leaves a photo of a young girl with the name Mercy written on the back. Tour guides don't include it on their official routes, but they all know the story. On quiet nights, they say, you can still hear singing from that spot. Not mournful now, but triumphant. A woman's voice, strong and clear, singing about troubled waters and freedom coming. The Whitmore name has vanished from Alabama. The family line scattered and dissolved. But Ruth Hartley's name lives on, whispered in resistance movements, written in history books that tell the true story of slavery's horrors, spoken by descendants who carry her defiance in their blood. Some say she still walks on Christmas morning, not as a ghost, but as a memory that refuses to die. They say if you stand where the church once stood, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear her speaking her truth. Love is stronger than fear, and one day that love will burn this whole rotten system to the ground. And it did. It took a war, a movement, generations of struggle, but it did. Ruth Hartley was right about many things, but she was most right about this. They hanged her body, but they couldn't hang what she meant. Every act of resistance carries her echo. Every mother fighting for her child channels her fury. Every person who says no more to injustice speaks with her voice. The haunting continues, will always continue, until justice is more than a word spoken in churches and courthouses. Until then, Ruth Hartley walks, knife in hand, reminding America of the blood price of its original sin and the terrible power of a mother's love pushed past all human endurance. In New Orleans, an old woman named Mercy lived to see the dawn of remedy, the 20th century. Before she died in 1903, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, all free, all educated, all carrying their grandmother Ruth's unbending spirit, she spoke her last words. Tell them Mama's story. Tell them she loved me more than life. Tell them she haunts this nation still and will, until every chain is broken and every child is free. The mourners thought she was delirious, talking about her mother as if she were present. But the oldest ones knew better. Ruth Hartley had never left. She was there in every fight for freedom, every demand for justice, every refusal to bow. She still haunts us. She always will. Thank you for joining us for this haunting tale of resistance, love, and the price of freedom. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below about how Ruth's story resonated with you. Remember, history's ghosts walk among us still, demanding we never forget the prices paid for justice. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told, and remember those whose voices were silenced but whose spirits remain unbroken. The December cold seeped through the gaps in the cabin walls like the fingers of the dead, but Ruth Hartley felt nothing except the fire burning in her chest. She lay on the straw pallet, eyes fixed on the rotting timber above, counting the seconds between each breath of the sleeping bodies around her. The slave quarters of the Whitmore plantation held 23 souls tonight. 3 days ago, it had held 24. Mercy, her baby girl, though 8 years old, was hardly a baby anymore. Sold to a trader from Mobile for $600. Master Cornelius Whitmore had stood there in his pressed wool coat, counting the bills while Mercy screamed for her mama, her small fingers clawing at the air between them until the trader, Jacob Burnett, had thrown her into the wagon like a sack of cotton. Ruth's fingernails had drawn blood from her own palms that day, the only violence she could permit herself. The overseer Ephraim Crenshaw had kept his rifle trained on the gathered slaves, waiting for someone to move to give him an excuse. Nobody had moved. Nobody ever moved. But tonight, on this Christmas Eve of our Lord 1855, Ruth Hartley was no longer nobody. She was something else entirely, something that had been growing in her chest for 3 days, feeding on grief until it transformed into something harder, sharper, more terrible than sorrow. From across the cabin she heard old Mary Cousins, whimpering in her sleep. The woman had been here longer than anyone could remember, had watched 3 generations of Whitmores grow fat on black suffering. Earlier that evening, as they'd prepared the big house for tomorrow's Christmas feast, old Mary had grabbed Ruth's wrist with surprising strength. "I see it in your eyes, child," she'd whispered, glancing around to make sure neither Crenshaw nor his assistant Moses Turner could hear. "Whatever you're thinking, you bury it deep. Bury it so deep even the Lord can't find it." But Ruth was past burying things. She'd buried her mother in the plot behind the tobacco fields. She'd buried her husband Solomon 2 summers ago after Whitmore had him beaten to death for looking too long at Miss Eugenia Whitmore's china. She'd buried enough. The cabin door creaked, and young Tobias crept in, barely 13 and already broken from a day in the fields. His eyes found Ruth in the darkness, and she saw fear there, not of her but for her. The boy had witnessed Mercy's sale, had seen something change in Ruth's face that day, something that made even the boldest field hand step aside when she passed. "Miss Ruth," Tobias whispered, but she turned away. There was nothing to say. Tomorrow would come whether they spoke of it or not. Through the thin walls she could hear singing from the big house. The Whitmore family, Cornelius, his wife Eugenia, their sons Theodore and Jasper, and daughter Constance, were entertaining guests for Christmas Eve. Judge Matthias Colton's booming laugh echoed across the frozen ground. The widow Mrs. Prudence Ashford's shrill voice carried on about the unseasonable cold. These were the people who would sit in the Mount Calvary Baptist Church tomorrow morning, singing hymns about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Ruth's hand moved to the space where Mercy used to sleep beside her. The straw was still pressed down in the shape of her daughter's small body. 3 nights, and Ruth hadn't smoothed it over. She pressed her palm against the indentation and felt something inside her crack like ice on a pond. Samuel Broadnax stirred in his sleep nearby. The big field hand had tried to comfort her after Mercy was taken, had promised that maybe Master Whitmore would buy her back someday, that sometimes masters did that. Samuel didn't understand that hope was just another kind of chain. And Ruth had broken all her chains 3 days ago, when that wagon rolled away with her baby girl screaming inside it. The kitchen knife was hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the cooking shed. Ruth had noticed it was damaged weeks ago, had reported it to the overseer as broken and disposed of. But instead, she'd wrapped it in oilcloth and hidden it, some instinct even then telling her she might need it. Tomorrow, she would retrieve it before dawn, when she went to help prepare breakfast for the family. She would wrap it in the cloth she used to bind her ribs, hidden beneath her Sunday dress, the rough gray wool that all the female slaves wore to church, marking them as property even in the house of God. A memory surfaced. Mercy's last Christmas, just 1 year ago. The child had made a doll from corn husks, had cradled it and sung to it the way Ruth sang to her. Silent night, holy night, in that sweet voice that sounded like morning birds. Master Whitmore had seen it, had laughed, and called his family over to watch. Look how they mimic us, he'd said, like little monkeys in clothes. He'd given Mercy a peppermint candy afterward, as if his amusement was a kindness, and Ruth had been forced to make her daughter say thank you for the humiliation. The rage built in her chest like steam in a kettle. She thought of tomorrow's service, of Cornelius Whitmore standing before the congregation, reading from his Bible about shepherds and wise men, while the blood of her family still stained his hands. She thought of his thick neck, how it folded over his collar when he bent to pray. She thought of the soft spot just below his ribs where a blade could find purchase. Ruth? The voice made her flinch. It was Delilah, who worked in the big house, with her. The woman's eyes were wide in the darkness. You're scaring folks, Delilah whispered. You ain't been right since— Go to sleep, Ruth said, her voice flat as winter ground. Delilah retreated, but Ruth could feel the fear radiating from the other bodies in the cabin. They knew something was coming. They could smell it like animals smell a storm. But they wouldn't stop her. They couldn't. To stop her would be to admit they saw it, and to see it would make them complicit. So they would close their eyes and pretend to sleep, and tomorrow when the blood was spilled, they would be as shocked as anyone. Ruth rose from her pallet and moved to the door, needing air. The night was crystal clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Somewhere in Mobile, her Mercy was spending Christmas Eve in a slave pen, probably sold already to someone heading west to Texas or Louisiana. The thought was a physical pain, sharp as any blade. From the quarters chapel, a rough building where they were allowed to hold their own services after the white folks' church, she heard Isaiah the preacher practicing his Christmas sermon. His voice carried on the cold air. Mary held her baby boy, born to save the world. Every mother knows that holding, that fear of letting go. Ruth's hands clenched. Mary got to raise her child. Mary got to watch him grow into a man. Mary got to be there at the end, even if that end was a cross. Ruth got nothing, not even a goodbye that wasn't torn from her arms. The knife waited for her in its hiding place. In the morning, she would bind it close, would sit through the carriage ride, to church with it pressed against her ribs like a second heart. She would listen to the hymns and the prayers, would watch Cornelius Whitmore perform his Christianity for his neighbors. And then, when he stood to give his testimony, he always gave a testimony on Christmas, always spoke about gratitude and God's blessings. She would move. She didn't expect to survive it. That wasn't the point. The point was that Cornelius Whitmore would die knowing why. He would look into her eyes as the blood left his body, and he would see Mercy there. He would understand finally that there were prices to be paid for everything, even for little girls sold 3 days before Christmas. Back in the cabin, Ruth lay down again. Around her, the others breathed carefully, feigning sleep. Tomorrow would be Christmas, the holiest day of the year. Tomorrow, the Whitmore plantation would learn what happened when you pushed a mother past all human endurance. Tomorrow, Ruth Hartley would write her name in blood across the floor of Mount Calvary Baptist Church. She closed her eyes and thought of Mercy one last time, not screaming in the wagon, but laughing last summer as she chased fireflies through the cotton fields, her joy so pure and complete that even bondage couldn't dim it. Ruth held that image like a talisman as sleep finally took her. In the morning, she would wake before dawn. She would retrieve the knife. She would serve breakfast with steady hands. She would climb into the wagon for church, and then, in front of God and everyone, she would have her reckoning. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering, as they had since the world began. But tomorrow, for just a moment, Ruth Hartley would make them pay attention. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below about what you think happens next in this haunting tale of desperation and defiance. Will Ruth's tragic plan come to fruition? What consequences await the Whitmore plantation? The horror has only just begun. Christmas morning arrived with a frost that turned the Alabama cotton fields into a glittering mockery of snow. Ruth Hartley had been awake for 2 hours already, the knife now bound tight against her ribs with strips torn from an old petticoat. Each breath pressed the cold metal deeper into her skin, a reminder that this day would be unlike any other. The kitchen of the big house was already sweltering despite the cold outside. Ruth moved mechanically through her duties, her hands steady as she kneaded dough for the breakfast biscuits. Beside her, Delilah worked in nervous silence, occasionally stealing glances at Ruth's impassive face. The other house slaves, Benjamin, who served as butler, Rachel, who tended to Miss Constance, and young Iris, who helped wherever needed, all gave Ruth a wide berth. "Ruth, fetch more wood for the stove," commanded Mrs. Eugenia Whitmore from the doorway. The mistress stood in her morning robe, her gray hair still in curl papers, her pale eyes sweeping over the kitchen with habitual displeasure. She had been beautiful once, before Alabama summers and 4 children had weathered her into something sharp and bitter. "Yes, ma'am," Ruth responded, her voice empty of anything that might give her away. As she passed Mrs. Whitmore, she caught the scent of lavender water and had to suppress the urge to recoil. Everything about these people, their scents, their sounds, their very presence, had become repulsive to her in the last 3 days. Outside, by the woodpile, she encountered Isaac, the stable hand. He was hitching the horses to the family's best carriage for the ride to church. His hands trembled slightly as he worked, and when he saw Ruth, he actually stepped back. "Morning, Isaac," she said, loading wood into her arms. He nodded but wouldn't meet her eyes. "Morning, Miss Ruth, you feeling all right today?" "Why wouldn't I be?" Isaac's mouth opened, then closed. He turned back to the horses without answering. Even the animals seemed nervous, stamping and snorting more than usual. Ruth wondered if they could smell the violence brewing in her, the way they might smell a coming storm. Back in the kitchen, the Whitmore family was gathering for breakfast. Master Cornelius sat at the head of the table, his thick fingers drumming impatiently as he waited to be served. He wore his finest black suit, the gold watch chain across his vest, catching the morning light. His sons, Theodore and Jasper, flanked him. Theodore, 23 and already developing his father's cruel mouth. Jasper, 19 and quieter but no less complicit in the plantation's brutalities. Miss Constance, just 16, chattered about the Christmas service, about who might be there, about whether the Ashford boys would attend. Her voice was like breaking glass to Ruth's ears. This girl who had never known a day of want or suffering, who had played with Mercy when they were both small until her mother had declared it inappropriate. This girl would watch a child, be sold away and feel nothing more than mild discomfort at the unseemly noise. Ruth served the biscuits, her movements precise and careful. When she leaned over to place Master Whitmore's plate, the knife shifted against her ribs and she had to bite back a gasp. He looked up at her, his piggy eyes narrowing. "You're mighty quiet this morning, Ruth." "Yes, sir." "Still moping about, that pickaninny?" He took a bite of biscuit, crumbs falling into his beard. "You should be grateful. That Trader Burnett will find her a good situation. Maybe a nice family in Texas. Better than here, working the fields." Ruth's hand tightened. On the serving tray, the rage rose in her throat like bile, but she forced it down. "Not yet, not here." "Yes, sir," she repeated. Mrs. Whitmore tutted. "Really, Cornelius, must we discuss such unpleasantness on Christmas morning?" "You're right, my dear. It's a day for celebration." He raised his coffee cup. "To the birth of our Savior, who teaches us that all things work according to God's plan." The family murmured agreement and continued eating. Ruth retreated to the corner of the room where the slaves stood during meals ready to serve. Benjamin caught her eye and shook his head slightly, a warning, a plea. She looked through him as if he weren't there. Ephraim Crenshaw entered then, removing his hat. The overseer's presence filled the room with the smell of tobacco and sweat. His eyes immediately found Ruth, and she saw suspicion there. Crenshaw was many things: cruel, crude, violent, but not stupid. He'd been watching her since Mercy was sold. "Carriage is ready, Mr. Whitmore," he reported. "I'll be riding alongside with Moses Turner, just in case there's any trouble on the road." "Trouble?" Whitmore laughed. "On Christmas morning?" "Really? Crenshaw. There's been talk of runaways over in Lowndes County. That group heading north never can be too careful." Ruth felt the overseer's eyes on her as he said it. He knew something was wrong, could sense it the way a hunter senses a wounded animal. But he was looking in the wrong direction, worried about escape when he should be worried about something far more immediate. The family finished breakfast and retired to dress for church. Ruth helped clear the table, each movement deliberate and controlled. The knife had warmed against her skin now, felt like part of her body. She thought of it as Mercy's revenge, a tooth for a tooth, blood for blood. Old Mary Cousins shuffled in from the quarter, dressed in her church clothes. She would ride in the wagon with the other slaves who attended services. Her rheumy eyes found Ruth and she began to cry silently, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. "Don't you cry for me," Ruth said quietly as they passed in the doorway. "I'm crying for all of us, child, for what's coming." "Nothing's coming that wasn't always coming." The old woman gripped Ruth's arm with surprising strength. "Your baby girl wouldn't want this." Ruth pulled away. "My baby girl isn't here to want anything." The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the frost. The household moved in its practiced Christmas rhythm. Slaves loading the carriages with cushions and lap blankets, the family emerging in their finest clothes. Master Whitmore wore his beaver hat, the one that cost more than Mercy had been sold for. The irony of it made Ruth's mouth twist into something that might have been a smile, if there had been any joy left in her. As she helped Mrs. Whitmore into the carriage, adjusting her skirts so they wouldn't catch in the door, the older woman suddenly grabbed Ruth's wrist. "You'll ride in the wagon today," she said sharply, "with the others." "But ma'am, I always—" "Not today." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes were cold and knowing. "Today you ride in the wagon." So even she sensed it. Ruth nodded obediently and walked to the slave wagon where Samuel Broadnax helped her up. The big man's face was grim. Young Tobias sat hunched in the corner, trying to make himself invisible. Delilah and Benjamin were there too, along with a handful of field hands who were allowed to attend Christmas service. As the procession pulled away from the plantation house, Ruth looked back once. The mansion stood white and gleaming in the way morning sun, its columns like bars of a cage she was about to break. Either she would never see it again or she would return to it in chains. Either way, after today, nothing would be the same. The road to Mount Calvary Baptist Church wound through 5 miles of Alabama countryside. They passed other plantations, the Hendricks place with its endless tobacco fields, the Colton estate with its new gin house. Other carriages and wagons joined them on the road, a procession of the faithful heading to worship a God who apparently saw no contradiction in their peculiar institution. Ruth sat perfectly still as the wagon jolted over ruts. The knife pressed into her with each bump, a reminder of her purpose. Around her, the other slaves sang softly, spirituals about crossing Jordan, about deliverance, about a better world coming. Ruth didn't sing. She had no more songs left in her. Crenshaw rode alongside on his horse, his rifle across his saddle. Occasionally, his eyes would find Ruth in the wagon, and she would meet his gaze steadily until he looked away. Let him wonder. Let him worry. By the time he understood, it would be too late. The church steeple appeared through the trees, white and sharp against the December sky. Mount Calvary Baptist Church, built 20 years ago with slave labor, where every Sunday, the Word of God was twisted to justify the ungodly. Ruth had sat in that colored section for 15 years, had listened to countless sermons about servants obeying their masters, about Ham's curse, about God's mysterious plan that somehow always benefited white folks. Today would be her last sermon. As they pulled into the churchyard, she saw familiar faces. Judge Colton helping his wife from their carriage, Dr. Elias Drummond speaking with Reverend Josiah Blackwood, the widow Ashford and her sons. These were the people who made up the machinery of bondage, who bought and sold human beings between prayers and hymns. They greeted each other with Christmas blessings, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Ruth climbed down from the wagon, smoothing her rough dress. The knife was invisible beneath the fabric, but she felt it might as well have been burning like a brand for how present it was in her consciousness. She followed the other slaves toward the side entrance that led to the colored section, but stopped for a moment at the threshold. Inside, she could hear the organ beginning to play, "O come, all ye faithful." The voices of the congregation rose, in song. Master Whitmore's bass carried over the others, proud and strong. He was probably thinking about his Christmas dinner, about the guests who would come later, about the new land he was planning to buy with the money from Mercy's sale. Ruth stepped inside into the warmth and the singing, into her destiny. The knife shifted against her ribs one more time, finding its perfect position. Soon now, very soon. The colored section of Mount Calvary Baptist Church was separated from the main sanctuary by a wooden rail, polished to a shine by countless hands, gripping it during service. Ruth took her place on the hard bench, feeling the eyes of her fellow slaves upon her. Old Mary Cousins sat to her left, her lips moving in silent prayer. Samuel Broadnax was to her right, his massive frame tense as a coiled spring. Below them, in the main sanctuary, the white congregation settled into their family pews like roosting chickens. The Whitmore family occupied the third row, their pew, marked with a brass nameplate that cost more than a field hand's value. Master Cornelius sat at the aisle end, his bulk spilling slightly into the walkway, his beaver hat placed carefully beside him. Reverend Josiah Blackwood ascended to the pulpit, his thin face glowing with what he probably thought was holy fervor. Ruth had always thought he looked like a vulture in vestments with his hooked nose and dark glittering eyes. He raised his hands for silence, and the organ's last notes faded into expectant quiet. "Brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his voice filling the space. "On this most blessed of mornings we gather to celebrate the birth of our Savior, who came to bring order to chaos, to establish the righteous path for all souls, regardless of their station." Ruth's fingers found the shape of the knife through her dress. The word station echoed in her mind. Mercy's station had been 8 years old and worth $600. Solomon's station had been 6 feet under after a beating that went too far. Her mother's station had been worked to death at 43, her hands so gnarled from picking cotton that she couldn't straighten them at the end. The congregation sang, "Angels we have heard on high," their voices rising to the vaulted ceiling. Ruth moved her lips, but produced no sound. Instead, she watched Cornelius Whitmore sing, watched his throat move, the soft flesh beneath his chin wobbling with each note. She memorized the rhythm of his breathing, the way he paused between verses. Theodore Whitmore turned once to look, up at the colored section, and his eyes met Ruth's. Something flickered across his face, discomfort perhaps, or recognition of something amiss. But he turned back to his hymnal, dismissing whatever instinct had warned him. Reverend Blackwood began his sermon taking his text from Luke, "And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." Even our Lord, Blackwood intoned, was born into humble circumstances, teaching us that God has ordained a place for everyone in his grand design. The shepherds in the fields did not abandon their flocks to follow a star. They returned to their duties, glorifying God in their appointed roles. Ruth felt bile rise in her throat. They always did this, twisted scripture to justify their cruelties, made God himself a collaborator in their evil. Her mother had truly believed, that suffering in this life meant glory in the next. But Ruth had held her daughter as she was torn away, had heard her screams fade down the road, and she knew there was no glory waiting that could balance that ledger. A memory invaded her thoughts. Mercy at 5 years old, sneaking into the big house library, running her small fingers over the books she would never be allowed to read. Mrs. Whitmore had caught her and beaten her with a hairbrush until her legs bled. That night, Ruth had held her daughter as she cried, and asked why God made some people to own books and others to be beaten for touching them. Ruth hadn't had an answer then. She had one now. Judge Matthias Colton rose to read from Isaiah. His voice was bourbon smooth, the voice of a man who had never been denied anything. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Peace. Ruth almost laughed. There had never been peace. Not for her people. Just the silence of the oppressed, mistaken for contentment by those who held the whip. The service continued its familiar rhythm. The widow, Prudence Ashford, gave a warbling rendition of What Child Is This? Dr. Elias Drummond led a prayer for the community's continued prosperity. Each word, each gesture, each pious expression was a mockery of the faith they claimed to follow. Then Reverend Blackwood spoke the words Ruth had been waiting for. And now, as is our Christmas tradition, we invite those moved by the Spirit to share their testimonies of God's blessings this past year. Several congregants stood and spoke. Mrs. Hendricks praised God for the successful tobacco harvest. Young Timothy Ashford thanked the Lord for his acceptance to the University of Virginia. Each testimony was a litany of privilege dressed up as providence. Finally, Cornelius Whitmore stood. Ruth's hand moved to her side, fingers finding the edge of the knife through fabric. Around her she felt the other slaves stiffen. They knew. Somehow they all knew this was the moment. My friends, Whitmore began, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. This has been a year of abundant blessings. Our cotton yield exceeded all expectations. My son Theodore has become engaged to the lovely Miss Catherine Drummond. God has smiled upon the Whitmore plantation. He paused, warming to his theme. Ruth slowly stood. A few heads turned toward her in surprise. Slaves didn't stand during white folks' testimonies. Old Mary grabbed for her hand, but Ruth stepped away, moving toward the rail that separated them from the main sanctuary. But more than material blessings, Whitmore continued, not yet noticing the disturbance. I'm grateful for the divine order that God has established, for the wisdom of Solomon that teaches us that there is a time and season for all things, a time to plant and a time to reap, a time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to cast away. Like mercy had been cast away. Ruth's hand went beneath her dress, fingers closing around the knife's handle. This Christmas, I'm moved to grateful tears by God's providence in allowing us to be shepherds to the lesser races, to guide them toward salvation through honest labor and Christian discipline. Ruth moved, not running but walking with terrible purpose down the side stairs from the colored section. The knife was out now, hidden in the folds of her skirt, but ready. Several people had noticed her, were beginning to murmur in confusion. Ephraim Crenshaw, standing at the back of the church, started forward, his hand moving to his pistol, but he was too far away and Ruth was already at the main aisle. Just this week, Whitmore was saying, his back to her as he addressed the altar, I was able to help a young Negro child find a new situation where she might better serve God's plan. Her name was Mercy. Ruth's voice cut through the church like a blade. Whitmore turned, confusion on his florid face. He saw her standing in the aisle, saw something in her expression that made him step back. Ruth? What are you? She lunged. The knife came up and out, catching the morning light through the stained glass windows, red and gold in holy terror. Someone screamed. It might have been Mrs. Whitmore. It might have been God himself. The blade found flesh just as the congregation erupted in chaos. Subscribe now and comment below. The climactic moment has arrived, but the horror has only just begun. What happens? When the oppressed finally break? When sacred ground becomes a killing ground? The blood is about to spill on this holiest of days. The knife entered Cornelius Whitmore's chest with less resistance than Ruth had expected. It slid between his ribs like it was finding its way home, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. His eyes met hers, wide with shock and something else, perhaps finally, understanding. You sold my mercy, Ruth said, her voice steady as mountain stone. Then time crashed back, and with it, chaos. Whitmore staggered backward, his hands going to the handle protruding from his chest. Blood bloomed across his white shirt like a grotesque flower. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, choking sound emerged. The congregation erupted in screams and movement, some fleeing, others frozen in disbelief. Ruth pulled the knife free and struck again, this time catching him in the shoulder as he tried to turn away. His blood splattered across the altar cloth, across the open Bible, across the cross that hung above them all. She raised the blade a third time, but strong hands seized her arms. Ephraim Crenshaw and Moses Turner wrestled her to the ground, the knife clattering across the floor. But Ruth didn't struggle. She had done what she came to do. As they pinned her down, she kept her eyes on Whitmore, who had collapsed in the aisle, his blood pooling on the holy ground. "Get the doctor!" someone screamed. "Dear God, get Dr. Drummond!" Eugenia. Whitmore had fallen to her knees beside her husband, her Christmas dress soaking up his blood. Her screams were inhuman, like an animal caught in a trap. Theodore and Jasper rushed to their father, trying to stop the bleeding with their hands, but there was so much of it, so much blood for one man to hold. "Papa, Papa, stay with us!" Constance wailed, held back by Mrs. Ashford. Dr. Drummond pushed through the crowd, his face grave as he knelt beside Whitmore. He took one look at the wounds, and his expression told everyone what they already knew. He began working anyway, calling for clean cloth, for water, for space, but his movements had the mechanical quality of a man going through motions he knew were futile. From the colored section, the slaves watched in stunned silence. Old Mary, cousins had collapsed, whether from shock or grief, Ruth couldn't tell. Samuel Broadnax stood gripping the rail so hard his knuckles had gone white. Young Tobias was crying silently, tears streaming down his face. Reverend Blackwood stood at his pulpit, mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Finally, he found his voice. This is the devil's work on Christmas morning in God's own house." The devil's work was selling her child, Ruth said clearly, her voice carrying through the church despite Crenshaw's knee on her back. "The devil's work was every Sunday you stood there and told us God wanted us in chains." "Shut her up," someone shouted. "For God's sake, shut her up." Moses Turner backhanded her across the face, splitting her lip. Blood ran down her chin, mixing with Whitmore's blood on the floor. The mingling of it seemed appropriate somehow, master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, all bleeding the same red onto the same sacred ground. Judge Colton had taken charge, ordering people back, trying to establish order. Everyone remained calm. "Crenshaw, get her out of here, take her to the jail. Sheriff Thornton, where's Sheriff Thornton?" "Here, Judge." Sheriff Roderick Thornton pushed through the crowd, his face pale beneath his whiskers. "I'll take custody of her." As they hauled Ruth to her feet, she got one last look at Cornelius Whitmore. He was still alive, but barely. His eyes were glazing over, his breath coming in horrible, wet gasps. Dr. Drummond was saying something about getting him home, about making him comfortable, but everyone knew what that meant. Theodore Whitmore suddenly lunged at Ruth, his face contorted with rage. "You killed him! You murdered him, you black witch!" Samuel Broadnax moved then, stepping between them, not aggressively, but simply placing his massive frame in Theodore's path. "No, sir," he said quietly. "Don't make this worse." "Worse?" Theodore screamed. "How could it be worse? She killed my father." "And if you strike her now in front of all these witnesses in a church, you become a murderer too," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the danger of a slave speaking so to a white man. "Let the law handle her." For a moment, violence trembled, on the edge of explosion. Then Judge Colton placed a hand on Theodore's shoulder. "He's right, son. The law will handle this. She'll hang for what she's done." Ruth laughed then, a sound that made everyone in earshot shudder. "I'll hang. I've been hanging all my life. Every day since I was born I've been hanging. At least now it'll be honest." They dragged her toward the door, past the congregation, that parted like the Red Sea. Some crossed themselves, others spat at her. The widow Ashford fainted into her son's arms. But Ruth noticed other faces too. A house slave from the Hendricks plantation who met her eyes with something that might have been understanding. A field hand from the Colton place who nodded almost imperceptibly. As they reached the door, She heard Cornelius Whitmore's death rattle. It was a sound she'd heard before, from her mother, from Solomon, from countless others worked or beaten to death. But this time, it was different. This time, it was justice. Outside, the December morning continued impossibly bright and clear. Birds sang in the trees. The sun shone on the church's white walls. The world hadn't ended. It seemed absurd that everything could look so normal when everything had changed. They threw her into the back of a wagon. Crenshaw climbed up beside her, his pistol drawn and aimed at her head. "You move, you die." "I'm already dead," Ruth replied. "Been dead since you took my baby." From inside the church came the sound of hymn singing. Someone had started, "Nearer, my God to thee," probably trying to restore some sense of order, of sanctity, but it was too late for that. The blood was on the floor, on the altar, on the cross. Mount Calvary Baptist Church would never be clean again. As the wagon pulled away, Ruth saw the slaves being herded together by armed white men. They would all be punished for what she'd done. She knew that. Old Mary, Samuel, Tobias, Delilah, they would all suffer for her act of defiance. But they would also remember. They would remember that one Christmas morning, one woman had said enough. One woman had made the masters bleed. The wagon passed the Whitmore carriage, still sitting where they'd left it, ready to take the family home after service. But Cornelius Whitmore would be going home in a pine box now. His Christmas feast would become a funeral meal. His new land would be bought with blood money in a different sense than he'd intended. Sheriff Thornton rode alongside, his face grim. "Why, Ruth? Why throw your life away like this?" She looked at him with eyes that held no regret. "My life was thrown away the day I was born into this. I just decided to throw it at something that mattered." Behind them, the church bells began to toll. Not the joyful pealing of Christmas morning, but the slow, mournful count of death. 1, 2, 3. They would ring 43 times, one for each year of Cornelius Whitmore's life. Ruth counted each one, storing them up like treasures. When they reached the jail, a crowd was already gathering. Word traveled fast in the county, and the impossible had happened. A slave had killed a master in church on Christmas. It was the kind of story that would spread like wildfire through the South, whispered in slave quarters and shouted in legislatures. As they locked her in the cell, Ruth sat on the narrow bench and closed her eyes. She could still feel Mercy's weight in her arms, could still hear her daughter's laugh. For the first time in 3 days, the fire in her chest had quieted. It was replaced by something else. Not peace exactly, but completion. She had done what she set out to do. Through the barred window, she could hear the chaos outside. Riders being dispatched to neighboring plantations, warnings being spread, the machinery of oppression grinding into higher gear. There would be new laws, harsher punishments, tighter controls. But there would also be whispers in the night, stories told in code, a name that meant resistance. Ruth Hartley, who killed her master on Christmas morning. She thought of Mercy, somewhere in Mobile or beyond, probably sold already to God knows where. Her daughter would likely never know what happened here today. But maybe somehow she would feel it. A shift in the air, a crack in the foundation of the world that said her mother had loved her enough to burn everything down. The blood was already drying under Ruth's fingernails. Cornelius Whitmore's blood, sacred and common all at once. She scraped a bit of it loose and watched it fall to the cell floor. Such a small thing, blood. But enough of it spilled, and the whole world changed. Outside, the Christmas morning continued, but it was a different world now. A world where masters could die just as easily as slaves. A world where submission was no longer guaranteed. A world where Ruth Hartley had written her name in blood across the floor of Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and that name would not be washed away. The reprisals began before Cornelius Whitmore's body was even cold. By nightfall on Christmas Day, the Whitmore plantation had become a scene from hell itself. Ephraim Crenshaw, drunk on whiskey and rage, led the punishment with a fervor that shocked even Moses Turner. Every slave on the plantation was gathered in the yard, forced to watch as examples were made. Samuel Broadnax was first. The big man who had dared to step between Theodore Whitmore and Ruth was stripped to the waist and tied to the whipping post. Crenshaw didn't count the lashes. He simply beat Samuel until his arm grew tired, then handed the whip to Turner to continue. Samuel never cried out, not once, but when they cut him down, he couldn't stand. His back looked like raw meat. "Let this be a lesson," Crenshaw shouted to the assembled slaves. "You all knew something was wrong with that woman. You knew and you said nothing." Old Mary Cousins tried to speak up to say they hadn't known, couldn't have known. But the stress and horror were too much for her ancient heart. She clutched her chest and fell forward into the dirt. By the time anyone thought to check on her, she was gone. They left her body lying there as a reminder while the punishments continued. Young Tobias tried to run. He made it as far as the tree line before the dogs brought him down. They dragged him back bleeding from a dozen bites, his screams echoing across the fields. Crenshaw had him branded on the face with an R for runaway, the iron hissing against his skin while the boy writhed and begged. Meanwhile, in the Montgomery County Jail, Ruth sat in her cell listening to the distant sounds of chaos. Sheriff Thornton had stationed 3 deputies outside, not to prevent her escape but to protect her from the lynch mob that had gathered. She could hear them calling for her blood, for burning, for tortures that would make her death last days. "You've destroyed them all," Sheriff Thornton said, standing outside her cell. "Every Negro on that plantation is suffering because of what you did." "They were suffering before," Ruth replied calmly. "Now the white folks are just being honest about it." Through her small window, she could see the torches gathering as night fell. The mob was growing. She recognized some faces. Poor whites mostly, the ones who owned no slaves but clung to their racial superiority like a lifeline. They were often the cruelest, having nothing but their white skin to elevate them above something. Judge Colton arrived near midnight with a document. "The trial will be tomorrow," he announced. "Justice will be swift." "Trial?" Ruth almost smiled. "What's there to try? I killed him. Everyone saw it." "Form must be observed," the judge said stiffly. "We are civilized people." This time Ruth did laugh, a sound that made the judge step back from the bars. "Civilized? You sell children and call it civilized? You whip men until their backs split open and call it civilized? Your civilization is built on our bones, Judge. Don't dress it up pretty for my sake." The next morning, they brought her to the courthouse in chains. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, people standing along the walls. The Whitmore family sat in the front row, all in black. Eugenia Whitmore's face was a mask of grief and hatred. Theodore and Jasper flanked her, their eyes never leaving Ruth. The trial was a formality. The prosecutor, a man named Wellington Hayes, presented the facts. Ruth Hartley had murdered her master in cold blood, in front of dozens of witnesses, on Christmas morning, in a house of God. The defense attorney, appointed by the court and clearly reluctant, mumbled something about temporary insanity brought on by the sale of her child. "Temporary?" Ruth interrupted, standing despite the chains. "There's nothing temporary about it. I knew exactly what I was doing. I'd do it again." The courtroom erupted. Judge Colton banged his gavel repeatedly. "The defendant will remain silent." "I've been silent for 28 years, Ruth shot back. "I'm done being silent." It took less than 5 minutes for the jury to return a verdict of guilty. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in 3 weeks' time, January 15, 1856. As they led her back to the jail, Ruth passed a group of slaves who had been brought to town to witness the trial, to see what happened to those who resisted. Among them was Delilah, her face swollen from a beating. Their eyes met, and Delilah mouthed a single word: "Mercy." Ruth nodded. Delilah was telling her that word had been sent, that somehow, through the network of slaves and free blacks that stretched across the South, Mercy would eventually know what her mother had done. It was the only Christmas gift Ruth could have asked for. Back at the Whitmore plantation, the aftermath continued to ripple outward. Eugenia Whitmore had fallen into a kind of madness. She wandered the house at night, claiming she could hear Ruth laughing, could see blood seeping through the floors no matter how many times they were scrubbed. She ordered all the female house slaves sold, unable to bear looking at any woman who might harbor similar thoughts. The economic impact was severe. Several field hands had died from the punishments, others were too injured to work. The plantation's productivity plummeted. Theodore argued with Jasper about selling the place entirely, starting fresh somewhere else. But land soaked in that much blood was hard to sell. Word had spread. The Whitmore plantation was cursed. Other plantations in the county implemented new restrictions. Slaves were forbidden to gather in groups of more than 3. Church attendance was suspended indefinitely. The Christmas holiday, traditionally a time when slaves were given a day of rest, was eliminated. The white population lived in fear, seeing potential Ruth Hartleys in every female slave's face. But in the slave quarters across Alabama, something else was happening. Ruth's name was whispered like a prayer. Stories spread, growing with each telling. Some said she had laughed as she struck the blow. Others said Whitmore had begged for his life. The truth didn't matter as much as the fact. A slave had killed a master and faced her death unafraid. 3 days before the execution, Reverend Blackwood visited Ruth in her cell. He carried a Bible and wore his most somber expression. "I've come to pray for your soul," he said. "Pray for your own," Ruth replied. "I know where I'm going, do you? You're going to hell for what you've done." Ruth stood and approached the bars, causing the Reverend to step back nervously. "Reverend, I've been in hell since the day I was born. Your God, the one you preach about, he put me there. So if there's another hell waiting, at least I'll be used to it. God doesn't. Your God watched my baby get sold. Your God watched my husband get beaten to death. Your God watches every whip fall, every family torn apart, every woman violated, and he does nothing. So either he doesn't exist or he doesn't care, or he's on your side. Any way you cut it, I want no part of him." Blackwood left without offering another prayer. The night before the execution, Ruth had an unexpected visitor. Theodore Whitmore came to her cell, alone against the sheriff's advice. He stood there for a long moment, just staring at her. "I want to understand," he finally said. "Why my father? He wasn't the cruelest master. He never beat you himself. He provided food, shelter." "He sold my daughter," Ruth interrupted. "He sold my baby girl 3 days before Christmas, for $600. It was business. The Iunyu plantation needed. Your father needed nothing. He wanted more land. He traded my daughter's life for dirt." Ruth gripped the bars. "You want to understand? Imagine someone selling Miss Constance. Imagine her screaming for you as they drag her away. Imagine never seeing her again, never knowing if she's alive or dead, beaten or starved or worse. Then, imagine the man who did it standing up in church praising God for his blessings." Theodore's face had gone pale. "It's not the same. She's not what? Not human? That's what you tell yourselves, isn't it? That we don't feel like you do, don't love like you do. But I loved my daughter more than your father ever loved any of you. He loved his land, his money, his power. I loved my child. And he took her from me for nothing more than greed." Theodore left without another word. But Ruth saw something in his eyes before he went, not understanding exactly, but a crack in the certainty that had always sustained him. The morning of January 15th dawned gray and cold. They brought Ruth, from her cell in chains, loaded her onto a wagon for the journey to the hanging tree. The crowd that gathered was massive, slaves forced to attend, whites come to see justice done, reporters from as far as Atlanta. As they positioned her on the platform, the noose rough against her neck, Sheriff Thornton asked if she had any last words. Ruth looked out over the crowd, found the faces of the slaves gathered at gunpoint to witness her death. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying on the cold wind. "My name is Ruth Hartley. I had a mother named Sarah who died in the fields. I had a husband named Solomon who was beaten to death. I had a daughter named Mercy, who was sold away 3 days before Christmas. I am not dying for killing Cornelius Whitmore. I am dying for loving my child more than I feared your whips. Remember me. Remember Mercy. Remember that love is stronger than fear. And one day, that love will burn this whole rotten system to the ground. The trap door opened. Ruth Hartley fell. But her words hung in the air like smoke, settling into the minds of everyone present, impossible to wash away. That night, in slave quarters across the county, children were named Ruth and Mercy. Songs were begun that wouldn't be finished for years. And in New Orleans, a young girl named Mercy, working in a hotel kitchen, heard from a traveling preacher about a woman in Alabama who had loved her daughter enough to die for her. The Whitmore plantation never recovered. Within 6 months, it was sold at a loss. The family scattered, Theodore to Texas, Jasper to Virginia, Constance married quickly and moved to Baltimore. Eugenia Whitmore died in an asylum in Atlanta, insisting to the end that she could see. Ruth Hartley standing at the foot of her bed, knife in hand, waiting. Mount Calvary Baptist Church stood empty within a year. Despite repeated cleanings, the bloodstains on the floor remained visible. Eventually, they burned it down. But locals said the ground where it stood never grew anything again. The reckoning Ruth Hartley had initiated could not be stopped with her death. It spread like cracks in glass, invisible at first, but growing, spreading, weakening the whole structure. 5 years later, when war came to the South, many would remember the woman who struck the first blow on Christmas morning, 1855, January 15, 1856, the morning of execution. The rope was rougher than Ruth had imagined it would be. As Sheriff Thornton adjusted it around her neck, she noticed things with peculiar clarity. The way frost clung to the hanging trees' bare branches, a red bird watching from a fence post, the smell of coffee from somewhere nearby. Someone was having breakfast while she was about to die. The crowd pressed close despite the cold. She saw Samuel Broadnax, his back still bandaged from the whipping, held upright by 2 younger men. Delilah stood with the other house slaves from various plantations, tears frozen on her cheeks. But there were others too, slaves she didn't recognize who had walked miles in the pre-dawn darkness, risking punishment just to witness this moment. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward to offer last rites, but Ruth turned her face away. I said, "My prayers already," she said loudly enough for all to hear. "I prayed to my mother and my husband. I prayed to all the dead who went before me. They're waiting for me now, and they ain't ashamed of what I done." As they positioned her on the trap door, Ruth's eyes found the horizon. Somewhere beyond it, Mercy was waking to another day of bondage. But she was alive. That had to be enough. "Any last words?" Sheriff Thornton asked, his hand on the lever. Ruth straightened her spine and spoke her truth one final time, her voice carrying across the crowd like thunder. After she finished speaking about love being stronger than fear, she added, "And tell the masters this. You can hang me, but you can't hang the memory of what I done. Every time you close your eyes, you'll see me. Every time you hear a floorboard creak in the night, you'll wonder. Every time a slave serves your food, you'll taste poison that ain't there. I'm gonna haunt you till the last of you is in the ground." The lever pulled. The door dropped. Ruth Hartley fell into darkness. But she was right about the haunting. 1 year later, Christmas morning, 1856, the ruins of Mount Calvary Baptist Church stood skeletal against the dawn sky. No one had tried to rebuild after the fire. The congregation had split apart, some joining other churches, others stopping their worship altogether. Too many claimed they could still hear the screaming when they closed their eyes in prayer. Marcus Hendricks, whose plantation neighbored the old Whitmore place, stood at the ruins with his overseer. They'd come to investigate reports of singing. In the night, "There's nobody here, sir," the overseer said nervously. Maybe it was the wind. But Marcus heard it too, low and mournful, a woman's voice singing a spiritual that seemed to come from the blood-stained ground itself. "Wade in. The water, children. God's gonna trouble the water." They left quickly and never returned. New Orleans, March 1858. Mercy, now 10 years old and working in the Trem district, learned the full story from a woman named Justine who had fled Alabama after the uprising. Your mama stood tall, Justine told her, holding the girl as she sobbed. She didn't bow, didn't beg. She said your name clear as day so everyone would know why she'd done it. Mercy grew quiet after that, something shifting in her young face. She started learning her letters in secret, taught by a free woman of color who ran a hidden school. When asked why she wanted to read so badly, Mercy replied, "So I can write my mama's name, so I can write it everywhere so nobody forgets." Montgomery, Alabama, December 1860. Theodore Whitmore, now managing a failing cotton farm in Texas, received word that his mother had finally died in the Atlanta asylum. In her final ravings, Eugenia had described Ruth Hartley standing at the window, not as she was in life but transformed. Her rough slave dress replaced by a white gown, the knife in her hand glowing like a star. "She's waiting," Eugenia had screamed. "She's waiting for all of us." Theodore burned the letter, but he couldn't burn the dreams that came after. Every night, Ruth in his father's study, blood spreading across ledgers that recorded human sales. Ruth in the church, but this time the congregation was all slaves and his family knelt in chains. Ruth at his bedside asking quietly, "Do you understand now?" He started drinking heavily. Within a year he was dead, his liver rotted through. His last words, according to his doctor, were, "Tell her I understand. Tell Ruth I finally understand." Abandoned Whitmore Plantation. April 1861. War had come to the South just as Ruth had prophesied. The plantation stood empty, its fields returning to wilderness. The new owners had lasted less than 6 months before abandoning it, claiming the place was cursed. A unit of Confederate soldiers made camp there briefly. Their captain, a man named James Ashford, son of the widow from Mount Calvary, wrote in his journal, "The men refused to sleep in the old slave quarters. They claimed to hear singing, a woman's voice, strong and clear, singing about freedom. Private Morrison swears he saw a Negro woman in the big house window, holding a knife that dripped blood that never fell. Superstitious nonsense, but I confess, the place unsettles me. There are bloodstains in the dining room floor that no amount of lie can remove. We leave at dawn. Battle of Montgomery. December 1864. A's. Union forces approached Montgomery. Enslaved people across the county began to rise. They sang a song that had spread through the South over 9 years, a song about a woman named Ruth who killed her master on Christmas morning. Ruth had a daughter, Mercy was her name, sold down the river, caused her mother pain, but Ruth took her freedom with a kitchen knife, gave up her body, but not her life. When the plantation houses burned, some swore they saw Ruth Hartley in the flames, no longer bent from labor but standing straight, her face triumphant. Others claimed that was impossible, just the heat making visions in the smoke. But every freed slave knew better. Ruth was there in every act of liberation, every chain that broke, every master who fell. Chicago, 1885. Mercy Hartley, she, had taken her mother's name the day she was freed, stood before a gathering of the Colored Women's Association. Now 38, she had become a teacher and activist, traveling the country to speak about the horrors of slavery and the courage of those who resisted. My mother, Ruth Hartley, is remembered as a murderer by some, a madwoman by others, she told the audience. But I tell you what she really was, a woman who loved her child more than she feared death, a woman who said no more when the cost of saying it was everything. She haunts this nation not as a ghost, but as a conscience, reminding us that injustice will always breed resistance, that love will always triumph over fear. After her speech, an elderly white woman approached her, Constance Whitmore, now Constance Mills, who had traveled from Baltimore in secret.